Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to folks who are here to discuss managed Kubernetes in Cluster API. This is the weekly feature group discussion. Cluster API is a subproject of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We're part of the CNCF, so we abide by the code of conduct. We raise hands, we're kind to one another, and we are collaborating in a spirit of openness and generosity. All right, so let's try to be brief every week. That's going to be my sort of organizational objective here, so we can expend as little of our time as possible and get better and better at doing some of this work asynchronously and have this just be a brief touch in. So I'm going to add my name here to the agenda. Other folks feel free to do the same. I think it's Bash and then company. So the only item I will add, and I'll do this in real time, is a brief discussion of this doc. I've added some material overnight, and I think maybe Richard and Winnie did the same. So let's see, I'll add that here. Proposal doc. And I will maybe pause for 10 seconds. Does anybody want to raise hands and suggest their own agenda item? And I'll give you time to type it down. Cool. Right. So I thought that it might be useful to start the, looks like we've got lots of good stuff here. Great. Start our sort of formal proposal doc by trying to reach consensus on goals and non-goals. So I'll briefly read through the motivation for any folks who are new, and the summary, I guess, just to make sure that the high level is crisply defined here and that folks understand what we're here to try to solve for. So the summary I have here is that we're discussing various options on how we might standardize and simplify managed Kubernetes use cases across the provider ecosystem. There's a few example providers there, by evolving or extending the existing cluster API specification. So as some folks here definitely know, and some other folks may know or may not know, this effort is sort of the inheritance of this previous managed Kubernetes and CAPI effort. And so I've borrowed some of the language there. In fact, when I was writing out this motivation, I thought that the language in the existing doc described much of it exactly the same as we want to describe here. And in fact, part of the reason we're here is that we really, I think, took the set of recommendations that emerged from this effort out for a spin in the fall and determined that it wasn't quite enough. So this is really a continuation of that. So the motivation and the problems are really similar. The difference in this at this phase of the game is that we are now exploring building the managed cluster specification into cluster API itself. And I know this is repetition for folks who've been to these before, but I just want to reiterate that that's really, I think, the summary of what we're doing. So I tried to put that here. It looks like we've got some notes from Richard, so I'll definitely incorporate those. But what I put is what we learned from that previous proposal effort is that scoping a standard solution to only a set of recommendations is insufficient to produce meaningful consistency. And instead, we conclude that a new standard set of cluster API specifications is needed to aid provider maintainers along a common architectural path. And let's see if we can, how can I get more real estate here? No. Richard doesn't agree with the statement. Great. So that's awesome. We should be doing most of this work async. But since we're all in person here, let me see if he has any comments on. Great. Okay, so Richard is essentially, at least in terms of the goals and non-goals, which I definitely want to incorporate his opinions, essentially wanting to sort of tone down the language that that this verb here, propose API changes, maybe is a little too strong in his opinion. And so really the goal is to reconsider, which we didn't in the original proposal from a few months ago, that we would actually update cluster API. So what I put here is, and I'm looking for raised hands, so it's not just me talking this whole time. But I put that line item, which is different from our previous engagements. I did put some sort of standard boilerplate language here, which you would include as a sort of ideal outcome of any API change. And then I wanted to point out cluster class in particular, because I know this was a sort of inciting incident for Kappa several months ago to even reconsider all this stuff, is that the sort of legacy EKS solution in Kappa didn't work with cluster class. It landed in Kappa before cluster class landed in Cappy, and so there was some functional non-compatibility. So I think that as we consider any future solutions in Cappy, that cluster class is absolutely a requirement for that. I think that sort of goes without saying, because cluster class is now a part of Cappy, and so anything getting approved into Cappy would have to be cluster class compliant. Okay, so I set as some non-goals. I feel like we shouldn't set as a goal any kind of invalidation of existing solutions. So we shouldn't introduce a specification that literally breaks. I don't think this is really possible, but I just wanted to state this clearly, that it's not our goal to say remove the existing set of legacy managed Kubernetes providers from the ecosystem. We're not concerned with that. At least that's my feeling on this. I think that this is maybe controversial, but I put that it's a non-goal to advise how to refactor existing managed Kubernetes provider implementations. This is kind of just carried over from the previous proposal. And another non-goal is to essentially to define what we did in the previous proposal and set some non-cluster API native standards as a requirement. So, this might seem like a lot of language here, but really what I'm suggesting is that this is a continuation of the previous proposal with the revised learning that we want to consider Cappy changes. So if anybody has any thoughts on that now, I'd be happy to just yield the floor and let folks discuss. Otherwise, I would encourage anyone to add any commentary to this async doc. Hopefully, because Richard was able to add his notes here, I assume the privileges are set up correctly. When the doc was created last week, at least the attempt was to provide members of SIG cluster Lifecycle edit access. So if you find that you don't have edit access or read access for that matter, just hit me up on Slack. Cool. It seems like folks are happy to just listen and bootstrap this information into their brain every week. Should we call it for this week and just encourage folks to go look at the doc and add their notes? Akinlolu, go ahead. Akinlolu, are you able to unmute? Can anyone else hear? No, okay. Sorry, my friend, we can't hear you. Let's see if you want to add in chat if you're having AV issues, we can discuss. Otherwise, again, hit myself or Winnie or Richard up on Slack, or just we can chat in the cluster API. Cool, sounds good. Winnie, go ahead.
Yeah, so I didn't have time to read through what's on the proposal. I started reading it this morning, and I know that so we have a few options listed here, but in my opinion, right, from option 1 to option 3 are pretty similar, but the last option we don't have it yet on the proposal, which is like adding the managed Kubernetes provider to Cappy itself. I think that's actually very different. So I hope that we can make a progress on that portion, because it's very hard for me to think about the trade-off of different options without like knowing the last option. So how can we make progress on that?
Can you clarify again, are you talking about one of the options in this original doc here?
Not the original doc, the new one.
Yep.
So yeah, so the new one, if you get the option 4.
So I guess I'm not sure about, This is all stuff that Richard has added. Okay, I haven't even looked at this. Cool.
Okay, so if you go all the way up for the table of contents.
Yep, cool.
Yeah. So the option 4, and I know that we've discussed about introducing managed Kubernetes provider type in CAPI itself, right?
Yep. So that's kind of
which
basically option 1 and 3 are variations of that. Let's see here. Well, that looks like this one would be new API specs. This one would change the behavioral requirements of CAP. I guess I can read through. Again, this is literally the first time I've seen this. But you're saying that Richard has brought up this option 4, which would be a new provider, like a multi-cloud managed Kubernetes provider within CAPI. I didn't even consider that. That's interesting. Is that a fair summary of what he's stating there?
So I don't know whether the language is right, but I think when we started this working group, I don't know whether it was you or Richard, but there was a discussion that, we want to make the managed Kubernetes as the first class citizen. So
yep.
why not introduce the API, the CRD in CAPI itself? Is that still the consideration or not?
Yes, that's for me. That's the sort of primary assumption, but I haven't really worked through all this. And as as anybody knows, as you start actually putting ideas on paper, they evolve, and so they could change. But my sort of bias coming in is something like this. That's probably why it's the first goal. I'm interested to read Richard's comments here, so that'll be really useful, because he may have thought this through more than me and be more aware of the trade-offs. But yeah, that's my assumption, is that we're not. I mean, I think that I'm really happy that Richard thought of this just as an option to consider. So as many options as we can go through the exercise of doing pros and cons, I think it's super useful toward building confidence and consensus. Does this speak to what you're asking at all, Winnie?
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I was not sure about this option 4, and yeah, like looks like you also saw it first time. So yeah, I think we can discuss, I think.
Yeah. Just to get my biases out in the open, my assumption from working with CAP-Z is that as a provider maintainer, the easiest is the wrong word. My intuition right now is that the best solution would be something like a single standardized CAPI native CRD spec like managed cluster that the providers were required to implement to do managed Kubernetes, which had the sort of minimum set of like API server endpoint data structure interface to express what managed Kubernetes generally does as a control plane with some like very sort of key common properties, and then allowed each provider to sort of flexibly implement its specific managed Kubernetes solution, just like we do for unmanaged Kubernetes or self-managed, whatever the traditional Kappa or CAP-Z, where you have a standard CAPI CRD to express various generic cluster properties, and then a thin wrapper on top of kubeadm. So you have those two, but from there, each provider can be very, very flexible to make it as sort elegant as possible to its particular user community. So something like that would be great for managed Kubernetes, I think.
So you're thinking more of a cluster and infra cluster and like machine and infra machine model?
I'm just thinking more about having a cluster API interface like managed Kubernetes that was behaviorally compatible with what managed Kubernetes actually is. So for example, in the CAPI behavioral assumptions of self-managed Kubernetes are that the cluster API control plane surface area, so the set of declarative configuration plus state data, is authoritative for that cluster's control plane. And that is not true in managed Kubernetes. In managed Kubernetes, the control plane state is from a cluster API point of view, needs to be passively consumed from the actual source of truth, which is the cloud provider. So whether it's EKS or GKE or AKS, as far as I can tell, there is no managed Kubernetes. We should definitely explore this, but as far as I can tell, managed Kubernetes solutions across the provider ecosystem are not built to assume that the control plane has a sort of split authority. The authority is the value proposition for the user is that the cloud provider is managing the control plane. And so the state of the control plane resides in the cloud provider's managed Kubernetes solution itself. So when you're building CAPI on top of it, that has to be a consideration. And one of the reasons why things are kind of, at least from a main developer maintenance point of view in, say, CAP-Z, one of the reasons why we're here is that implementing managed Kubernetes in CAP-Z at present and Kappa and CAP-G, you have to do some sort of funny hacks because CAPI does not know about the sort of behavioral assumptions I just laid out, where it's going to passively consume control plane state data. So you have to do sort of just in time like diff analysis, like, okay, am I different? If I'm different, then prefer the change downstream from the managed Kubernetes provider, which is not a normal CAPI gesture. So I would love to see those hacks not be necessary going forward. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, makes sense.
Cool. Well, I'm super grateful that Richard added a bunch of stuff. So I would encourage the rest of you to weigh in pro and con on all these things. I'll be going a point of administrivia. I'm going on leave. My wife's having a baby in the next few months, so I'll be out only for a few weeks in February is the plan, assuming everything's healthy, and then back for a few months and then going on leave later. So don't worry about the later part of this community, but I'm going to try to prioritize getting this doc in decent shape in the next couple of weeks, just sort of selfishly, so I can participate. So I might be bugging folks for answers to questions and things like that. Cool. Well, 8 minutes of our time back, and then see some of you at top of the next hour.
Thank you.
Awesome,
All right, yeah,
thank you.
and hit me up, Akinlolu, if you want to, or any of us up in CAPI Slack, we can have a thread discussion. All right, thanks, folks.